Okay, well, since y'all are busy people with limited time, maybe we'll go ahead and start with introductions as people continue to join. So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Darby Menton, and I'm a research scholar at the Berkeley Risk and Security Lab. And we're really thrilled to have such a great group of panelists for our first virtual event, a webinar addressing the Iran nuclear crisis in the aftermath of President Trump's withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action 5 years ago yesterday. Our research portfolio at BRSL includes both nuclear non-proliferation issues, as well as broader questions pertaining to global governance. So we're really thrilled to be hosting this conversation today. And before I introduce the panelists, I also wanted to thank our co-sponsors, the Institute of International Studies, the Nuclear Science and Security Consortium, and the Nuclear Policy Working Group. We're really grateful for your collaboration and the way you're addressing these issues as well. So the context for this conversation today, yesterday marked the 5-year anniversary of Trump's decision to pull out of the JCPOA. Of course, a lot has happened in the intervening years. At the capabilities level, we've seen estimated breakout time shrink from 12 months to about 12 days. And despite the so-called maximum pressure campaign, Iran has significantly advanced its nuclear program. There's also been some pretty major changes, both in terms of the domestic politics of the various states involved, and the international relations in the international context more broadly. And so I'm sure we're going to get into more detail during the panel and all of this. But I think it's fair to say that the state of affairs right now is pretty grim, and we're looking at a potentially untenable status quo as Iran becomes ever more capable and diplomacy seems to have reached a kind of impasse. So thankfully, we've got a really great panel of experts here today to help us unpack all of this and think about where we stand now and what we might be seeing going forward. So I'm going to introduce the panelists in a second, but a few housekeeping notes. The session will run for about an hour. I'll moderate the conversation for the first 40 or so minutes and then open it up to Q&A. And so the way you do that is you put the questions into the Q&A function in Zoom. So to briefly introduce our panelists, we're really lucky to have them here today. So Dr. Hanna Notte is a senior research associate at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation and a senior associate with the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Nicholas Miller is an associate professor of government at Dartmouth College, and he's written extensively on U.S. non-proliferation policy and nuclear security issues more broadly. And Sahil Shah is a senior fellow and program manager at the Council on Strategic Risks and a senior Iran policy advisor at the European Leadership Network. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. And to kind of kick things off, I wanted to give each of you some sort of space or a couple minutes for some top line reflections on where we stand 5 years after the Trump administration's decision to pull out of the JCPOA. So where are we now? How did we get here? What are the kind of key things to be thinking about as we move into potentially a new phase of this crisis? And so I think maybe starting with Nick and then going on to Sahil and Hanna. So I'm going to hand it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Jane, for the invitation and introduction. Thank you to everyone for coming out virtually. Unfortunately, as Jane mentioned in her introductory remarks, I think things look pretty bleak on the Iran nuclear front. So Iran is closer now to a nuclear weapons capability than any point in its history, including all the time period leading up to the JCPOA. And that's, very much a direct outgrowth of President Trump's decision to withdraw from the deal in 2018. Iran's currently accumulating a pretty large stockpile of 60% enriched uranium, which technically speaking is not very far away from weapons grade, which people usually put at a threshold of around 90%. If the deal was still kind of alive and functional, Iran would be limited to enriching to 3.67%. That limitation would have stayed in place until 2031. If you look at the political and geopolitical situation, it unfortunately does not seem very conducive to diplomacy between Iran and the West in particular. So hardliners are ascendant in Iran. Iranian leaders don't seem particularly interested in a deal, and they haven't for a while now. One of the ways you can tell that is they've made sticking points out of issues that they presumably know that the United States cannot resolve, right? So a demand, for example, that any future president cannot withdraw from the deal, right? It's just not something that is feasible. You can't tie a future president's hands, right? And yet it's something they've asked for. Demands to end the IAEA probe into undeclared nuclear activities and materials from their past nuclear weapons program. Similarly, kind of a non-starter, right? And yet they've continued to stick with that position. If you broaden it out and look at kind of the geopolitics, Iran's decision to provide support to Russia in the war in Ukraine, and I know Hanna will talk about this more, I think has made diplomacy with Iran even more politically toxic than it already is in the United States. Right? And it starts from a pretty high level of toxicity to begin with, right? And then you're adding this issue on top of it. There's currently intense hostility between the United States on one side and China and Russia on the other. And I think that means great power cooperation on the Iran nuclear issue, which is pretty important leading up to the JCPOA, is quite unlikely. I think the intense geopolitical hostility also means that the great powers are pretty busy and distracted and focusing on things other than Iran. Recognizing all of this, I think it's possible that leaders in Iran might perceive that they have kind of a fleeting window of opportunity to make big advancements in their nuclear program. Right? That doesn't mean they would go all the way to a nuclear weapon, but they may think now is a pretty good time to build a large stockpile of highly enriched uranium that could be used down the road to produce a pretty significant number of nuclear bombs if they make that decision. Right? And they've already made pretty significant progress on that front. The last thing I'll say is that even if we kind of zoom out from the geopolitical landscape and just look at kind of the bilateral calculations Iran might be making in terms of its relationship with the United States, I think it was always going to be a pretty big ask to get Iran to return to the JCPOA or to agree to any other sort of deal with Washington, right? And the main reason for that is Iranian leaders would have every reason to believe that any deal with the US would be torn up basically the moment that a Republican is back in the White House, just because of kind of the Republican position on engagement with Iran in general. And I think this might be the most kind of consequential long-term impact of Trump's decision to withdraw. I think it fundamentally eroded America's ability to strike these sort of non-proliferation deals that can be very important to serving our national interests. So I'll stop there and interested to see what my fellow panelists have to say.
Thank you so much. So maybe handing over to Sahil now.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Shane. As you mentioned, I work as a Iran policy advisor for the European Leadership Network, where for 4 years I monitored this file on a daily basis and was constantly in touch with officials that were negotiating the resumption and restoration of the JCPOA. But as of 6 months ago, I took on a new primary role, and that's allowed me to really zoom out and to reflect on the past few years. So thank you for the opportunity to be able to share some of those and to be in dialogue with two experts who I very much admire. Of course, we're all here to talk about the US withdrawal of the JCPOA under the Trump administration, but of course, that's not the reason why alone the JCPOA is in the state that it is today. Overall, one of the key lessons learned is that maximum pressure was a strategic failure that didn't deliver on any of the kind of key goals that famously former Secretary of State Pompeo had outlined it intended to do. Biden, unfortunately, has continued this strategy in practice, despite wanting to get tougher on Iran in a smarter way, as he famously outlined in his CNN op-ed before taking office. And that isn't entirely his own fault. The Europeans were uneasy at the beginning of his administration as to what they should do moving forward, despite the Biden administration wanting to focus on the JCPOA's restoration first before dealing with other issues. Of course, the war in Ukraine has complicated matters further, and Iran has put forward several obstacles that are seemingly impossible to overcome. Some of the kind of key takeaways of the past few years, especially sitting here in Europe, is that the Europeans, the exit of the US from the JCPOA was sort of a watershed moment in which a lot of officials on this side of the Atlantic began talking more and more about strategic autonomy and the need to have more agency in the cases in which they don't align with US policy. Of course, they tried to do that by mobilizing humanitarian trade, especially during the pandemic. And even that, despite being legal under international and domestic law, wasn't really possible because of the strength of US sanctions. So US sanctions were a success in terms of creating a lot of fear and overcompliance, but it backfired because the Europeans were unable to protect and showcase any kind of ability to keep diplomacy open on the JCPOA. Iran's nuclear program, as a result, expanded, as Nick has just outlined very well. And with it, the risks of conflict also expanded. There were many flare points over the past few years that were notable and alarming. Of course, diplomacy began eventually under the Biden administration. And around a year ago, in March of last year, we had a pretty good package on the table. There are three parts of the text. One on the return of the US with an outline technically of how they would lift secondary sanctions, a second roadmap on how Iran would resume its commitments on the nuclear side, so the fate of enriched material, what would happen to centrifuges, etc. And the third on how this would sort of all fit together with key points in time at which each side would need to deliver things. So essentially the sequencing of all of this. Despite this being on the table in March, things became more and more difficult, mainly, I would say, because of the Iranians. There were still questions over how they could guarantee the US would not leave the deal again, which of course is impossible to guarantee legally, meaningless to guarantee politically, because Biden will not be president forever, and perhaps too complicated to guarantee technically. So things like comfort letters or how to assure that companies that re-enter the Iranian market wouldn't be abruptly ripped out of the Iranian market just at potentially as early as the next election. The Iranians were then stuck on the safeguards issue, despite this arising from their obligations under the NPT and their Comprehensive Safeguards Agreement, which has nothing to do with the JCPOA. So for a variety of reasons, between March and August, when we had the next moment of opportunity, either the Iranians wanted to maximize profits and their leverage, or stretch out the negotiating time, or avoid a deal entirely. We'll never really know. But because in the fall, we had the complicating factors of the suppression of Iran's domestic protesters, as well as Iran aiding Russia's efforts in Ukraine, primarily through the sale of drones, political willpower was lost, diplomatic space became impossible to protect, and now we're in some sort of a no deal, no crisis situation, which I largely owe to the budding regional diplomacy that's underway. So with that, and without getting into sort of potential future eventualities or how we could break out of this impasse, I'll leave it there and I'll turn to Hanna to talk more about that ending point of the nexus between Russia, Ukraine, Iran, US, and Europe. Thanks so much.
Shall I go, Jane? Yeah. Thank you. And yeah, thanks, Nick and Sahil, for these really useful comments and sort of giving the lay of the land. I'll focus a little bit more in my remarks on Russia's role and how the war in Ukraine has affected the state of play with the JCPOA over the last year in particular. Now, before I do that, I want to sort of remind everyone at the outset that Russia, for the most part, for a very long time, has been a constructive partner for Western countries on the Iranian nuclear dossier throughout the 2000s, without sort of going into detail. But I mean, Russia softened but never vetoed a string of UN Security Council resolutions related to the Iran file. Of course, it was an important partner in negotiating the JCPOA. And then in the period after the Trump withdrawal, Russia also argued for the restoration of the deal. It was very concerned about the US withdrawal. And I would note that particularly in the period of 2021, after the Biden administration came into office and resumed diplomacy to return into the deal, Russia's mediation was quite instrumental in that period, 2021, and then up to the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. That period was marked by active Russian mediation on several occasions between Iran and the IAEA, for instance, regarding access to the Karaj facility in Iran. There was a clear desire on the Russian side to compartmentalize the Iranian nuclear dossier from the broader deterioration in Russia's relations with the West. And occasionally, Russia would publicly voice concerns over Iranian breaches with its obligations under the JCPOA. For instance, when they enriched to 60%, you would see Russian officials coming out with sort of words of caution or concern. The occasional public scolding or expression of urgency, especially when there was a hiatus in the talks after the Iranian elections and Raisi becoming president. We had the 6 months hiatus, and the Russians would occasionally sort of express urgency to return to the table. And Russian experts would sort of express privately that they saw the Iranians as the greater problem in terms of return to the JCPOA than the American side. Now, I would argue that really changed with the invasion of Ukraine. Sahil just noted that we were close to a deal in March of 2022 when a lot of elements were on the table. And that's when Russia for the first time appeared to throw wrenches into the talks, when in early March it demanded written guarantees that its cooperation with Iran would be exempted from sanctions that were introduced against Russia over the invasion of Ukraine. Now, it's true that Russian diplomats walked back those demands some 10 days later, when Foreign Minister Lavrov stated that, in fact, Russia had received guarantees, written guarantees to that effect, that cooperation would be able to continue. But nonetheless, there was, I think, a perception that this Russian maneuvering somehow stole the momentum in mid-March, and that it created a perception in Western capitals, I think, that Russia was no longer so keen to compartmentalize the Iranian nuclear dossier from the war in Ukraine. And I would argue that already before the issue of drone supplies became really vexing in the context of the JCPOA, there was already a perception that the war in Ukraine affected Russia's, I would say, eagerness to see a return to the JCPOA. It was somewhat less active in mediating between the different sides, and I think this is partially why the Qataris and also the EU stepped more to the fore last summer. There was less willingness to sort of criticize or call upon the Iranians publicly, certainly. And even when last summer there was this appearance of Iranian stalling on the final text that was on the table at that time, Russian public statements would sort of shield Iran. And I think this really comes down to what I see as a somewhat reduced Russian both ability and willingness to put pressure on Iran or encourage Iran to return to the deal. Why? Because of the changing geopolitics of the Russian-Iranian relationship, and because Russia's confrontation with the West over Ukraine, I would argue, became the organizing principle of Russian foreign policy. And it started to affect dossiers that were previously sort of walled off from that broader confrontation, including nuclear arms control and non-proliferation. And then, as Sahil noted rightly, from October, the drone supply issue, in addition to the protests in Iran, became additional irritants. Of course, the drone supplies made apparent just how dependent Russia had become on Iran in the context of the war in Ukraine. And I just would like to note here, because I think it's important to mention, that the issue of drone supplies to Russia did not just form a negative political backdrop to talks to restore the JCPOA. It actually has become a legal issue regarding Resolution 2231, because Western states have alleged that Iranian drone supplies to Russia are inconsistent with Resolution 2231. They've demanded an investigation. Now, the UN Secretary General, in its semi-annual report on Resolution 2231 in December, did not offer definitive conclusions in this regard. And Russia, of course, has argued that the UN Secretary General doesn't even have the mandate to authorize such an investigation without a decision from the UN Security Council. And this just goes to say that it's not just a political issue. I mean, I think certainly, and Sahil, I'm sort of interested in your take, but for European capitals, the drone issue has become an enormous political issue because Iran is seen as directly complicit in the war in Ukraine. But it has also become this legal issue related to Resolution 2231. Perhaps I'll end here and happy to take further questions.
Well, I want to thank all three of y'all for that. I think that's a really phenomenal, comprehensive overview of some of the many complicated and intersecting issues that we're facing. And also, why this is such a really thorny problem. So maybe a couple of things to pull out of this. I think all three of you kind of touched on two things that affect both this particular crisis and non-proliferation more broadly. The first being this question of American reliability and the way in which the Trump administration's decision underscores that and makes that relevant in a different way, but also potentially, a shifting Russian attitude or putting less of a priority on non-proliferation more broadly. I mean, that's going to impact beyond this crisis. So maybe, Hanna, I just wanted to follow up with you briefly. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how the changing dynamics of the Iranian-Russian relationship, what we might see going forward. Is there any potential for that shifting? So for example, if Iran did cross a threshold, would Russia start being more concerned or becoming more cooperative again? Or is this like a broader shift in terms of what they're going to prioritize and where they're going to be putting political capital?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. I mean, the first thing to say here is that I do believe that we've seen a qualitative change or shift in the Russian-Iranian relationship over the last year. I mean, this is a relationship that was historically marked by mistrust. The economic dimension of the relationship was for a long time not that interesting, with the exception of Russia's work on the Bushehr reactor and arms sales. But, there had been this attempt to bring it to a qualitatively different level, and that never quite happened. But you see a lot more activity over the last year to really broaden and deepen economic cooperation, this convergence in opposition to sort of what Russia and Iran claim, sort of US hegemonic Western-led order. And so there's, you see a lot of high-level visits constantly and a lot of activity. And of course, if we talk about the drone supplies, that's just one side of the medal. There's also concern about what Russia might be providing Iran in return in terms of military defense cooperation, from Sukhoi 35 fighter jets via naval assets, air defense, to potentially even support for Iran's missile program and space-launched vehicles. So that's a space that a lot of people are watching with apprehension. But I do want to sort of say that, there's still a question mark to my mind in terms of how far Russia wants to see Iran sort of carry forward its game with nuclear hedging. So I think there's good strategic reasons for why Russia should not want Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. And I can sort of briefly go through them. I mean, the first thing to note, and this is sort of me just giving a sort of a rational strategic argument from Russia's viewpoint. But the first thing to note is that it is extremely likely, no matter the course of the war in Ukraine sort of going forward, that Russia will come out weakened conventionally, its military force weakened conventionally from this war in Ukraine, and that nuclear weapons will again become elevated in Russia's doctrine for the purpose of deterrence and coercion. So that Russia, which has always, I think, seen nuclear weapons as something that's reserved for a club of the few privileged, as a symbol of status, should not want to see other countries that Russia itself considers middle powers, whereas it itself considers itself a great power. This Russia should not want other states to join this nuclear club. That's the first thing. A second point here is that Russia is concerned still, I think, even though it is deepening its relations with Iran, it's concerned about a certain balance in the region. It also still invests very much in its relations with Israel and the Gulf Arab states, and doesn't want to appear to be sort of only in Iran's basket. If you are a strategist sitting in the Kremlin, you also need to account, at least for the possibility, that there could be regime change in Iran at some point, and that there could be a government coming to power that is less friendly disposed towards you than the current regime. So that should also sort of make Russia cautious. But the main reason, I think, why I don't think Russia wants to see Iran crossing the nuclear threshold is that the current situation of Iran's hedge and the point that it has reached and the activities that Iran is undertaking short of crossing that threshold, I think serve Russia strategically very well at the moment, because this Iranian hedge consumes bandwidth and resources from Western states. It generates uncertainty and tension in the Middle East, and thereby it deflects attention away from both Asia Pacific as well as, of course, NATO's eastern flank and the situation in Ukraine. So, it is entirely in line, I think, with what's conducive right now to Russia's interests in the region and also vis-a-vis the West. So I think that's where they stand currently. But I mean, is it inconceivable that Russia could, having had a legacy for a long time of caring about non-proliferation, sort of start making an exception for Iran in this new era of confrontation? I don't think it's entirely inconceivable, but I also haven't seen sort of convincing evidence to date that Russia is actively supporting an Iranian nuclear weapon.
So maybe a question for Sahil and Nick, looking at what we now see as this kind of impasse in terms of the way the traditional diplomatic approach has gone. Are there other avenues where there might be potential to get a little bit more traction? So Ali Vaez and Vali Nasser published a piece in Foreign Affairs yesterday suggesting that regional diplomacy might yield a sort of more enduring and more viable solution to this. I'm curious whether or not y'all think that there are other avenues through which we still might be able to make some progress given the pretty significant obstacles that you've outlined so well.
Okay, I can take a stab at that one. I mean, you can imagine like a bunch of different avenues, at least in theory, where some progress could be made, right? Some people talk about a less for less deal instead of the JCPOA, and there's some reporting to suggest the Biden administration was at least exploring that, right? So where Iran would get some form of limited sanctions relief, and they would make some concessions on the nuclear side, maybe like freezing enrichment at the levels it's currently at, and not stockpiling additional, 60% enriched uranium or something. But the Iranians seem to have very little or no interest in such an arrangement, right? And so that leads us to these other potential options. You mentioned this foreign affairs piece. There's a certain logic to it, right? I mean, following on what I said at the outset and what we've been talking about in terms of America's reliability. If you don't think the United States can be relied on to live up to any bargain it reaches, maybe you try to find a way to address this without involving the United States directly, right? And maybe, the Gulf states can offer something to Iran that they find valuable enough to agree to limits on their nuclear program. I admit to being somewhat skeptical of this, and I think it's maybe a little bit too ambitious. So, I mean, the piece that you mentioned, one of the things that they talked about was the Gulf states could maybe say, in exchange for you, Iran, limiting your enrichment program to a certain level, we agree we're not going to enrich, right? And there's sort of an asymmetry there in the sense that these other states don't have enrichment programs, right? And so they're agreeing not to do something that maybe they weren't ever going to do, and that was a long way off anyway. And so I'm not really sure like how much of a concession that appears to be for Iran. And if you look at it from the Iranian perspective, I mean, one big question is, what do they make of what they've gotten out of this advanced hedging posture, right? And, a lot of people are talking about these normalization deals that are going on between Iran and its neighbors, right? And it's possible that some leaders in Iran think that that's not unrelated to their nuclear program, right? And maybe they think, well, everyone sees, how advanced our nuclear program is. They see kind of our influence in the region on the rise. They see the US as maybe being more reticent about getting involved. And so they've been kind of forced to make peace with us. And if that's the way the Iranians are looking at it, it's not clear why they would want to roll back their nuclear program. And they might think that's actually kind of the big, one of their big, trump cards that's actually influencing the way the politics are going in the region. So I'll stop there, but I'm interested to see what Sahil has to say about this.
Yeah, I'd love to add to that. In preparation for this webinar and also in preparation for speaking to some ambassadors in Tehran, I sketched out probably 5 potential outcomes. And I'm very thankful to people like Ali and Ali for putting forward ambitious ideas, because we do need to raise the level of ambition. And diplomacy, can work at times when we least think it's possible. So having all ideas on the table, I think, is important. And for those ideas not only to be socialized to the US and European systems, but also within Iran as well. And having two eminent scholars like Ali and Bali write something like that means that, those ideas will be taken more seriously. So the first potential outcome, which is looking less and less likely, I actually, ahead of today, surveyed one P4 plus one official each. And I asked on a 1 to 10, do you think the JCPOA or any kind of diplomacy that results in an agreement, formalized agreement, is possible this year? And the average response I got out of 10 was a 2.166. So that's all the P5 minus the US and then plus Germany. So not looking so great, but it is a potential outcome, right? The JCPOA is restored. It's not the floor. It's the floor and not the ceiling for future cooperation. And based on the most recent plan that was most recently discussed amongst all of these entities in the fall, is that there be a phased approach where there's a confirmation period where the US Congress and Iranian parliament undertake different processes, then a preparatory period on both sides to prepare for re-implementation day, and then choreograph steps. Of course, it'd be difficult in some ways because a lot of the questions would not be answered, especially on the Iranian side. For example, the IAEA would be able to verify that Iran has taken steps to restore the JCPOA, but there's no similar body to verify that the US has necessarily done what it needs to do. This would, as of the most recent draft, mean that Iran would return to JCPOA stockpile limits with the excess shipped out to Russia in exchange for a certain quantity of natural uranium, exactly like in 2016. Operational enrichment capacity would return back to 2016 with excess centrifuges be installed and put into storage in Iran under IAEA seal and monitoring. And although Iran jumped ahead in terms of research and development, there would be quite strict limits on manufacturing to make up for it. So these are some of the kind of technical tenets of if we were to restore the JCPOA, as it was agreed to potentially restore in August, this is what it would look like. However, this is, as Hanna and Nick have outlined, has largely become overcome by events, right? People often ask me, is the JCPOA on the agenda? Is it on the table? It's really hard to know, but I would say no on both accounts for the reasons already explained. And then I'm also often asked, is there a fundamental lack of interest in the JCPOA, or is it in Iran, or is it because they know that the other side really isn't putting it on the table in a meaningful way, or that there isn't enough political bandwidth on their end to actually push it through? Again, hard to know, but important to kind of pay attention to. Also, Iran is happy to wait more generally because they feel it'll be better to stay under sanctions, which they're continually adapting to, than to rush back into a JCPOA agreement with insufficient assurances that the economic benefits can be delivered even under Biden or into another administration. They'll also feel it'll be worse to have a second phase of maximum pressure in 2024 onwards after a short period of sanctions relief, rather than just staying under sanctions from now and developing more resiliency. So even just if you look at the economics and how the economics are being discussed in Iran, there really doesn't seem to be much of a case for them doing anything this year. The second potential eventuality is this kind of regional, bigger, better, longer, stronger deal, whether it includes the US or not. And I think Nick has covered that really well, and I agree with his assessment. The third is some sort of an interim agreement, whether that's an informal kind of gentleman's agreement between Iran and the US. But this could be, a face-saving way to buy time, or it could be something, more formalized. But both would be complicated. If it's an informal measure or informal kind of agreement, how do you verify that? And if it's a formal one, how do you find a sweet spot? What the US and the Europeans would want from Iran in terms of ceasing proliferation-sensitive activities, for example, all enrichment above 5%, advanced centrifuge production, et cetera, that would probably require on the Iranian side for a majority of sanctions lifting. So at that point, an interim deal isn't really that much far off from a full resumption of the JCPOA. Fourth potential eventuality, I think, is the status quo. So like I said, no deal, no crisis, some level of managed escalation dynamics where the Iranian expansion of its nuclear program and the expansion of the US sanctions regime don't go overboard. So perhaps through regional mediation or through European mediation, there's a really good understanding of red lines and how they're potentially shifting. And under this scenario, you could have positive things happening, like Iran restoring cameras or engaging in political dialogue with the agency. And that's because I think what Iran has decided is that they're not against doing things like that, because where they've decided to respond proportionally is more in the area of capabilities rather than limiting transparency. So they've so far taken a relatively softer touch approach towards the current stalemate. We don't know how long that potentially could last. I think a lot of it is because of that regional diplomacy that's budding that we've all been talking about on this webinar. I think it's important that we don't allow it to go into the fifth potential eventuality, which is total escalation dynamics, where we have the potential for sabotage, conflict, etc., raised substantially, little to no communication. And again, we're avoiding this for now, but we don't know for how long. So even if the US and Iran and the Europeans in Iran cannot talk about the JCPOA or resuming some sort of diplomacy on that front, it's very important that they do talk about how to ensure that this doesn't move from the status quo into a situation where we are past the brink and can no longer find ways to speak to one another.
Thank you for that. And I actually kind of wanted to bring Hanna and Nick back in, building off on some of what you said. I think that especially after about 5 years in which a lot of these conversations have been revolving around the JCPOA, whether that's reviving or restoring it or enhancing it, the sort of idea of a longer, stronger deal, I think really in recent weeks, we've begun to see that the idea of a plan B is becoming more of where the conversation is. Because as you say, sort of events overtaking things. So I was hoping that we could talk a little bit more specifically, even if we have a pretty limited scope of action, however we do it, what are some of these red lines that are most important from a risk reduction standpoint? What kind of activities are a sign that, Iran is sticking with a hedging posture as opposed to moving forward into a different proliferation scenario? I know, Nick, you've written about this a little bit, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of what are the activities or actions that we really don't want to see and what will we find reassuring even in a bad situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. In the non-proliferation context, this can be very tricky, right? Figuring out where to set the red lines. And if you look at kind of like the history of Iran's nuclear program, you see that they have pretty smart and effective strategies at getting around them, right? And one common approach, which is what Thomas Schelling called salami slicing, right? You just kind of slowly erode little red lines bit by taking small incremental steps that individually are not dramatic enough to force a strong reaction, but over time accumulate into really big advancements in their nuclear program. Like, are you really going to attack us or sanction us if we increase our enrichment level from 3 to 5? No, probably not. What about 5 to 10? What about to 20? Right. And then eventually you get to the point where it's really concerning. So from my vantage point, the most important red lines that the United States should be setting and communicating to Iran, and I assume that the Biden administration is doing this, is making sure Iran does not go to weapons grade uranium, right? Not enriching to 90%. I would also be communicating to Iran that a decision to withdraw from the NPT and kick out inspectors entirely would be also a step that would lead to a strong response. Because once the inspectors are gone and there's no oversight over Iran's nuclear program, it just becomes much harder to be assured that they're not engaged in a nuclear weapons program. What's interesting is looking at some of the rhetoric coming out of the Biden administration and how that may or may not differ from the Israelis, for example. Right. So Jake Sullivan just said the other day, the Biden administration was going to ensure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon, right? And you've often heard U.S. presidents say that for years and years and years. From my perspective, that's actually a pretty bad red line, right? Because Iran could not violate that red line and get extremely close to having, a workable nuclear weapon. And then by the time they got close enough, they'd be able to cross those final hurdles in a way that would be very difficult to detect. Right. And it also gets at this question of like, what do we even mean by a nuclear weapon? Right. Does it have to be, the 90% enriched uranium that's mounted on a missile? Or what if you just have kind of warhead, right? And do all the components have to be together or not? Do you have to test a nuclear weapon? Do you have to declare it? These are all these sort of ambiguities that can come into play with that formulation. And so I think it's important to kind of stick to these more specific red lines that are a bit easier to verify, like, are you enriching to 90% or not? And are the inspectors still having access?
Hanna, do you have anything you want to add on that? Oops, sorry, I haven't unmuted myself. So we've got a couple questions coming in, so I want to give time in case any of the attendees want to add. So the two questions that have come in so far are really looking at Ukraine. So I think, Hanna, maybe if you want to start in addressing this, we've got one saying, I would be interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts about what the impending Ukrainian counteroffensive and how it might make Russia's-Iran relationship more complex. How might Russia's threat/use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine affect the relationship with Iran? And also, what are the most possible and appropriate areas in which Russia will thank Iran for supporting its war in Ukraine? So again, more on this site. I think you're the perfect person to answer these questions. So.
Sure, I'm happy to take a step. So, I mean, look, how will the Ukrainian counteroffensive affect what we're discussing here and the Russian-Iranian relationship? I think it really depends on how the counteroffensive will go for Ukraine. There's been a great divergence of assessments, some recent cautioning, both from the US government as well as Ukrainian officials themselves. Not to sort of overpromise the results that can be delivered and the territory that can be retaken from under Russian occupation. But I think it'll basically depend on how much Russia will judge that it'll need more Iranian capabilities. I mean, we're now in a situation where Russia has used extensively Iranian Shahed 136 drones to target mostly Ukrainian infrastructure and energy infrastructure over the winter months. And there's an assessment out there that says that was a strategic failure. The intention was to create a very, very harsh winter for the Ukrainians and basically make them suffer to an extent that they would break, right? And that hasn't happened. Ukrainians have emerged through this winter and they're standing, and they've shot down a lot of those drones. They've intercepted quite successfully. Also, of course, they got more and more sophisticated air defense from various Western countries. But there's an assessment out there that this drone campaign failed. Now, what we're already starting to see, though, is that Russia is still using these systems, and it's increasingly using them not just against Ukrainian cities or infrastructure, but against military targets on the Ukrainian side. And the question will be, to what extent will that continue? And are we going to see Iranian missiles deployed in Ukraine? It is something that Western states have been concerned about for months. As far as I'm aware, we have not actually seen it happen. There was some reporting earlier this year. I think the FT suggested that Western officials felt that both Russia and Iran grew cautious about that kind of cooperation, that Russia was hesitant because it was afraid that if it were to procure Iranian missiles, that then Western states might give Ukraine long-range weapons, and it didn't want to see that. But, we are also in a situation where Russia has, from what we understand, rapidly depleted its own stockpile of long-range precision-guided weapons. It is probably reserving its most sophisticated arsenal for a contingency of a war with NATO, so it's not using everything. And what it is using has not been used to great strategic effect. A few days ago, Ukraine reported to have shot down a Kinjal hypersonic air-launched ballistic missile over Kiev for the first time. So this is the situation in which we're in, and which it's going to be interesting to see. And I don't have a good sense, quite frankly, of whether we will see Iranian missiles deployed on the battlefield. And of course, if that happens prior to October 2023, when the relevant provision under Resolution 2231 under the JCPOA expires, some people have suggested if the Iranians give the missiles, they'll wait until after October. If we see it before then, I would assume it will even further complicate any efforts to return into the JCPOA. If it happens after, Western states will still not be thrilled. So I think really the question about the Ukrainian counteroffensive and the trajectory of the war in Ukraine, the question is really what Iranian capabilities will we see sort of coming? So that would be sort of to the first question. Quite frankly, what a hypothetical Russian tactical nuclear use against Ukraine would mean, I'm a bit sort of hesitant to speculate. I would like to think that Russian nuclear use would be such a taboo break that no state in the world would find itself in a position not to be able to criticize that. Whether it would really then shift the dynamics of the Russian-Iranian relationship subsequently, I think that's really hard to predict. That depends on a lot of other factors. And in terms of the second question of where sort of Russia can, I suppose, sort of, what was the question? Sort of show its gratitude towards Iran for the support. I mean, so it's my understanding that Iran at this point, and given where its own nuclear program stands, doesn't really need a hypothetical Russian support on the nuclear side, on the nuclear program. I think the assistance that we might see from the Russian side that will be most valued will certainly be in the military defense domain, but it will be other things, which I already sort of listed when I first spoke. I think it's going to be fighter jets. It's going to be perhaps other air defense systems. It's going to be naval assets for the Iranian Navy. And I think there is a concern about certain Russian assistance to the Iranian missile program. I think those are the areas. There's also been some reporting that the Russians have given Iran certain cyber capabilities, communication surveillance capabilities more recently. I think those are the kinds of areas to watch.
Do either of y'all have anything you want to add on that? Okay, we've got a question now about China. So what role might China play here, especially in light of the recent sort of role in brokering the rapprochement between Saudi and Iran diplomatically, and what kind of expectations might Iran have vis-a-vis China? So I think that's a really interesting question, bringing in more players here.
I don't mind taking a stab at this, but I'm sure Nick and Hanna have more to add. I think probably it's important to touch on a few points. The first is what China's role has been in the diplomacy to try to get the JCPOA restored. So what I would say is that China, whether because of COVID or for internal reasons, they probably had the smallest and least, senior delegation as part of the negotiations. Their representation was entirely comprised of their representation based in Vienna at the Chinese mission there, whereas the other countries had many officials that were part of the negotiations from their actual capitals. So there was a rather muted Chinese presence, I would say, in the restoration negotiations for the JCPOA. However, that may be irrelevant because they weren't very active in the year leading up to the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. They sort of just swooped in at the end after there were 3 or 4 regional players that had created quiet tracks between Iran and Saudi Arabia for the year prior. So yeah, it may make a difference, it may not make a difference, but I would just say that we should caution ourselves because the amount of bandwidth that the Chinese gave the JCPOA restoration wasn't as much as some may think. The second is of course, there is now a breakdown in diplomacy between the US and China, which will basically mean that there's less opportunity for there to be alignment on regional issues or on issues like trying to reduce proliferation risks in the region. However, that doesn't mean that the Europeans may not be able to help try to get the Chinese to take a more active role. And just lastly, overall, there's a lot that's being discussed in terms of Russia's new approach, Iran's new approach towards Russia and China. And, they're shifting to an alignment policy rather than a neither East nor West position. That's absolutely clear. And this more of an alignment policy is a form of sort of external balancing in which they see there's a transitional international politics underway. There's a new structure in terms of multipolarity, and it's about counter coalition building. Regional rivals are making coalitions. Russia and China are seeking allies in different regions. So this is an opportunity for Iran. But there are limits to how far Iran will go in terms of this kind of alignment policy. There are very active, healthy debates in Iran, especially when it comes to how far Iran should go in entangling itself or aligning itself with China. So there's a complicated domestic picture to also pay attention to. So yeah, so those are just three kind of quick points in terms of China's role or lack thereof in the JCPOA restoration process, and whether that actually can tell us anything about what kind of role they might take moving forward. What the breakdown in US-China diplomacy might mean in terms of creating enabling opportunities for further progress, and whether Europe can step in. And then third, to say that the kind of domestic situation in Iran when it comes to alignment with China or Russia is far more complicated than I think the West often reduces it to.
I could add a couple things to that, just building on some of Sahil's remarks. We do have historical precedent for this idea that great power competition erodes non-proliferation, right? And we saw this like in the early part of the Cold War when the US and the Soviet Union were overwhelmingly focused on competition with each other. They tended to be more lax on proliferation and to look the other way. Or in the case of the Soviet Union, they actually initially helped China develop nuclear weapons and later kind of pulled back and regretted that decision. In the 1980s, the US kind of turned a blind eye towards Pakistan's nuclear program because we were in this, intense period of the quote second Cold War, right? And the US was so worried about the Soviet Union occupying Afghanistan. So I do think there's a possibility for similar dynamics today, right? And we have probably the most intense great power tensions that we've had since the Cold War, right? And so it's possible non-proliferation kind of goes onto the back burner for China, Russia, and maybe in some cases even the United States. I don't think China wants Iran to get nuclear weapons. The same way I don't think Russia wants Iran to get nuclear weapons. The question is, how much are you kind of willing to do to prevent it, right? And are you willing to put kind of that relationship at stake in order to prevent it? From China's perspective, an unrestrained Iranian nuclear program is not necessarily the worst thing in the world, like if it keeps the United States having to pay a lot of attention to what's going on in the Middle East, right? And diverts some of their attention from East Asia. And then one last thing I would say about this, China does not have a particularly strong track record on non-proliferation in general. It's kind of gotten better on the issue over time, but China helped Pakistan acquire nuclear weapons actively. China was pretty problematic in a lot of its dealings with Iran in the 90s and parts of the 2000s, and they never kind of fully, turned the screws on North Korea, right? And they often played sort of a interference role at the UN, right? Watering down sanctions resolutions or preventing them from being passed, right? And there were no UN sanctions that were passed on North Korea over their nuclear program until after they conducted their first test, right? And so China's part of the reason for that. So I would just say there's reasons to think that non-proliferation is not necessarily going to be the overriding objective for China.
Thank you for that. I think we've got time for one more audience question. So we've got a question about sort of US-Iran relations in particular, and the very sort of specific relationship that these two countries have had. So the question is, would a formal apology from the United States to Iran for the 1953 coup help with future relations between the two? And I think there's a broader question of, this has gotten to a point where there's been the accumulation of very particular historic things. Is there anything that can be done to sort of simmer things down at what seems to be almost an interpersonal level between the two states?
I'll talk a little bit about this issue of an apology and give a plug to my colleague at Dartmouth here, Jennifer Lind, who has written the book on apologies in international relations. I'd recommend anyone who's interested to buy it. Her main finding is basically that apologies like this, even though they sound good in theory, can often backfire, in part because they activate all these domestic debates in the country that's apologizing that just kind of communicates to the target of the apology, in this case, Iran, how much controversy there still is about it, right? So if you imagine what it would look like, and it's very hard to imagine this, but if you imagine the United States making an apology to Iran for the coup or for, you know, the withdrawal from the JCPOA or something else, that would arouse a very intense domestic debate in the United States. And you'd have conservatives and Republicans, you know, having very heated rhetoric about all of the terrible things Iran has done to the United States and its allies. And Iran would be observing this, right? And they'd be able to see that the United States was in no way united on this issue. In fact, you might see kind of more intense anti-Iran rhetoric as a result of this apology in the United States. And so I wouldn't put a lot of weight in an apology kind of transforming the relationship. I'm sure my co-panelists have some other thoughts too.
I don't actually have anything to add, no. That was a good answer to a question I hadn't thought about before, so.
Yeah, I also have nothing to add on that. I mean, I fully agree with Nick. What I would say is that there could have been symbolic gestures made, especially in the area of humanitarian trade, that would suffice as an apology for maximum pressure, really making it difficult for the Iranian population to be able to import medical goods, PPE, vaccines, etc. But that window would have been in the early months of the Biden administration. So I think if we are talking about apologies, I don't think that they will really make a substantial difference. But you know, it's never too late to make gestures that show that when we say that we care about the Iranian people, that we actually mean it. And when we say that we want to find a diplomatic solution to this impasse that really both sides have now played a role in creating. But of course, the US began by withdrawing initially from the deal, or violating it, as some like to say, since there's no withdrawal clause in the text. There's still room if there is a time in which the domestic political environment in the US is more receptive to doing something, which is hard to see at the moment. I think it would be important for the Biden administration to weigh the failure of their inaction in the early months of the administration and see whether or not they should take a different approach if an opportunity arises. But of course, at this point, I would say that where we're at today and the opportunities squandered last year really do come down to Iran putting up more and more obstacles. But that's due to a deep level of mistrust that stems from Trump's action 5 years ago that we've gathered to talk about here today. So it's hard to get into a blame game, but one party needs to make positive, proactive steps before the other feels that it can. And I think the onus still remains sort of on the US to do something positive, which would be useful.
Just a very quick two finger on this, because, Sahil said it, it's never too late to engage in gestures which show that we care about the Iranian people. I think the difficulty that we have now since the beginning of the protests in Iran in October is also that some people have opened up this dichotomy about a policy vis-a-vis Iran that is driven by non-proliferation concerns and the JCPOA, and a policy that cares about human rights, and there's now powerful constituencies in Western countries who argue we should not engage in any gestures whatsoever vis-a-vis Iran that help us get back onto a path where we can restore the JCPOA, but that if we mean it in pursuing, for instance, like here in Germany, a feminist foreign policy, then what we really need to do is put the human rights situation at the top of our foreign policy agenda and forget about the nuclear deal. And I think that new situation has even further complicated the issue of gesture making vis-a-vis Iran.
I think that's a really important point. And I have so many more questions, but I think at this point we should probably wrap things up. I want to say thank you again to all three of you for joining us today, and to the audience for such interesting and thought-provoking questions. I think it's very clear how complex things are, but hopefully there's a little bit more clarity about where those complexities lie. Again, incredibly grateful to the panelists and to our sponsors, the Institute of International Studies, the Nuclear Science and Security Consortium, and the Nuclear Policy Working Group. So from the BRSL standpoint, just to let you know, if you enjoyed the session today, you should follow us on Twitter, sign up for our newsletter. We'll be taking a break from events until the end of the summer, but we'll be back in the fall for more events like this. We hope that you'll join us for those. And again, really grateful and thankful for your time today. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your Tuesday.